He believed the world was improving. Not loudly, not proudly, just quietly, the way a man believes tomorrow will behave itself. He folded the morning paper with careful hands, smoothed the crease, and stared at a headline that promised peace through progress. Trains were faster now. Lights burned through the night. Voices traveled across wires. It felt impossible that something so modern could still fall apart. Somewhere deep inside him, a doubt stirred. He ignored it. Everyone did, because when a world wants to sleep, it tells itself comforting lies. And the biggest one was this: that war belonged to the past. What no one admitted was how tense the silence had become, how every smile felt rehearsed, how every parade marched a little too stiffly. The world wasn't calm. It was holding its breath. And breath held too long always breaks. Europe before the war was dressed in confidence. Tall hats, polished boots, flags everywhere. Empires stretched across maps like proud signatures written in ink stolen from other lands. Progress buzzed in the air. Electricity hummed. Engines rattled. Factories sang. It felt like history had finally figured itself out. But beneath the music was friction. At the heart of it all sat a continent pretending to be civilized while sharpening knives under the table. The great powers gathered like relatives forced into the same room. Smiles tight, compliments thin, old insults waiting for the smallest excuse to return. The island empire to the west ruled the seas and trusted its navy more than its neighbors. Across the channel, a wounded republic still remembered a humiliating defeat decades earlier. Its pride hadn't healed. It had only hardened. To the east rose a young industrial giant, loud with ambition and aching to be taken seriously. Farther still sprawled a frozen empire, massive and uncertain, ruled by a man who believed authority came from heaven and not from listening. In the middle sat a crumbling kingdom stitched together from too many peoples and too few agreements. It looked solid from a distance. Up close, every seam was splitting. They called it balance. It was anything but. Alliances were signed with elegant pens and nervous hands. Promises were stacked atop promises. The idea was simple. If everyone promised to defend everyone else, no one would dare start a fight. Instead, they built a trap. One spark would pull every nation into the fire at once. Military planners dreamed of speed, of honor, of glory. They imagined horses charging, flags waving, bands playing triumphant songs. They did not imagine mud that swallowed men whole. They did not imagine guns that fired until barrels glowed. They did not imagine silence broken only by screaming. They should have. Weapons improved faster than wisdom. Cannons grew louder, rifles more precise, ships heavier, faster, crueler. Factories fed the arms race like furnaces fed by fear. And all the while, diplomats spoke softly about peace, as if saying the word enough times might make it true. National pride thickened the air. Children learned songs about greatness. Newspapers printed stories about enemies lurking just beyond borders. Everyone believed they were defensive. Everyone believed they were right. In the southeast, the tension burned hottest. Old empires had retreated, leaving behind questions no one could agree on. Small nations dreamed of independence. Bigger ones feared collapse. Borders meant everything. History meant more. And memory sharpened every grievance into something personal. It was a place where names mattered, where dates mattered, where the past never stayed buried. The great powers watched this region nervously. Like men standing around a cracked dam, they argued over influence, over loyalty, over who belonged where. Each step meant to stabilize only made the ground less steady. And still, people slept. They went to cafes. They attended concerts. They wrote letters about weather and health and trivial worries. Summer arrived. Flowers bloomed. Children played. The world looked peaceful enough if you didn't listen too closely. But somewhere, plans were being finalized. Trains, schedules refined. Orders written and sealed. Men practiced speeches, meant to sound regretful while justifying violence. The machine was assembled piece by piece, each part insisting it was only preparing for safety. No one thought the match would be struck so clumsily, so accidentally, so human. It would not begin with a battle or a declaration shouted from a balcony. It would begin with confusion, with fear, with a wrong turn, and a moment that refused to pass quietly. History likes to pretend it moves by design. In truth, it often stumbles. As the world drifted towards sleep, comforted by its own arrogance, a single day approached. A visit, planned to casually, a warning, ignored to easily, a city, holding its breath beneath summer light. No, one knew they were standing on the edge, but the ground already knew, and it was beginning to give way. The decade before the war looked peaceful from far away. Up close, it sounded like grinding teeth. Europe kept smiling for photographs. It hosted fairs and conferences. It spoke of reason. It celebrated science like a new religion. Men in suits stood on stages and promised that modern nations were to advance to destroy themselves. And yet, behind the curtains, every government was making plans for exactly that. The strongest grudge sat between two neighbors who shared a border and it wound long before 1914. One had beaten the other and taken a strip of land that felt like more than soil. It was pride. It was memory. It was the kind of loss that lives inside schoolbooks and family stories, on French maps. The stolen region was shaded like a missing limb. Teachers pointed to it with quiet anger. Children learned to stare at it until it felt personal. In German streets, the new empire celebrated itself as a young, rising power, confident and restless. The resentment did not fade. It ripened. Germany's rise changed the whole table. It arrived late to the imperial feast and wanted a larger seat. Its factories were loud. Its railways were fast. Its army was disciplined. It carried itself like a man who had waited too long to be noticed. But the older empires did notice, and they did not like the new energy in the room. Germany wanted colonies. It wanted ships. It wanted recognition. The Kaiser, the emperor at its center, wore uniforms like armor and spoke as if every sentence was a challenge. He dismissed careful advice. He pushed for a great navy to match the greatest navy in the world. Britain heard the message clearly, and Britain responded the only way it knew. It built more ships. The naval race became a cold argument, fought in steel. Dreadnought battleships rose from shipyards like floating fortresses. They were enormous, expansive, beautiful in a brutal way. Each new launch made newspapers cheer and treasuries groan. In quiet rooms, admirals studied numbers and drew lines on maps. If war came, it would come quickly. They believed, if they prepared enough, it would not come at all. That was the illusion. On land, armies grew too. Guns improved. Artillery learned to reach farther. Machine guns became common, waiting patiently for the first foolish charge. Military budgets swelled. Politicians approved them because voters loved strength, and because fear always sounds like common sense. There were peace meetings, there were speeches, there were medals, and then there were railways. Railways were meant to connect cities, carry goods, and shrink distance. But by this decade, they also became instruments of war. Every major power planned troop movements down to the minute. A schedule could decide victory or disaster. Mobilization was no longer a slow gathering of men. It was a lever pull it, and the whole nation lurched toward conflict. Once those trains began to roll, stopping them would become almost impossible. Not because people lacked courage, but because their own systems would demand momentum. In the East, an enormous empire watched all of this with uneasy eyes. Russia was vast and heavy. Its cities were modernizing, but its politics stayed stuck in the old world. The Tsar, its ruler, believed he had been chosen by God. He saw compromise as weakness. He saw reform as danger. But Russia was not stable. Years earlier, it had lost a war it thought it could win easily. That defeat shook the country and pulled anger into the streets. Workers struck. Peasants rioted. Soldiers fired on protesters. The Tsar made promises, then quietly ignored them once the noise faded. It left Russia restless and desperate to look strong. So Russia leaned toward the Balkans. toward the small Slavic nations that looked up to it for protection. Helping them made Russia feel important, and it detracted from the cracks at home. But it also brought Russia closer to a region already trembling. The Balkans were not a single place. They were many places, many tongues, many memories pressed into one corner of Europe. Empires had ruled there, retreated, and left behind a vacuum. And into that vacuum poured ambition. Serbia was young, proud, and hungry for unity. It dreamed of gathering South Slavs under one banner. That dream was not just political, it was emotional. It was the kind of dream men died for. Austria feared that dream more than it feared foreign armies. Austria-Hungary was an empire of many peoples, and not all of them wanted to stay. Its leaders wore confidence like a coat, but underneath, they were cold with worry. If Serbia inspired Slavic independence inside its borders, the whole structure could unravel. So Austria-Hungary watched Serbia, the way a nervous man watches a match near Dreistraw, Germany. Tied to Austria-Hungary through alliance, it feared isolation. It feared being surrounded by rivals. It promised support to its uneasy partner, and in doing so, it placed its own fate on the same shaky ground. France leaned toward Russia, Britain leaned toward France. The alliances became a web, and the web tightened with every crisis. In 1912 and 1913, wars in the Balkans proved how fast violence could spread. Borders shifted. Victories made some countries bolder. Losses made others bitter. Serbia emerged stronger and louder. Austria-Hungary emerged more afraid. Each side told itself it was defending against aggression. Each side felt threatened. Each side took another step closer to the cliff edge without looking down. Ordinary people felt the tension like weather. Some days the air seemed heavy. Rumors traveled. Newspapers printed warnings and insults. But daily life continued. Shops opened. Markets filled. Lovers walked along rivers. The world carried on because it had to, and because most people couldn't imagine what was coming. They thought if a conflict happened, it would be quick. A short war. A clean war. A war with clear winners. Men would return by winter. Bands would play, flags would wave. Streets would celebrate. It was a comforting fantasy. In truth, the continent was a pressure cooker. Polished and quiet on the outside, boiling on the inside. It only needed a crack in the lid. That crack was forming in a city under summer light, where a royal visit was being planned, and where young men whispered about a different future. A single day was approaching, and a single mistake would soon make every plan unstoppable. The day began like any other. That was the problem. Morning lights spilled across narrow streets. Shopkeepers opened doors. Church bells marked the hour. The city looked calm, almost proud, dressed for a visit that was meant to show order and control. Instead, it would expose how fragile both truly were. The heir to an empire arrived with his wife beside him, riding in an open car. He was stiff, serious, and tired of politics. She smiled more easily. This day mattered to her. It was one of the few times she was allowed to stand publicly at his side. They believed the danger had passed. It hadn't. Along the planned route, young men waited, not soldiers, not professionals, just boys, really thin, nervous, fueled by ideas bigger than themselves. They had pistols, they had small bombs. They had convinced themselves that history needed their hands. They also had no real plan. As the motorcade rolled forward, one of them acted. A bomb flew, it struck the car, bounced, and exploded behind it. Smoke, shouts, chaos. The royal couple escaped unharmed. The assassin panicked. His poison failed. The river he jumped into barely reached his ankles. He was dragged away, coughing and humiliated. The others froze. The visit continued at the city hall. Polite speeches echoed in a room too warm for comfort. The heir's voice cut sharply when he spoke of bombs instead of welcomes. His words were cold, controlled, angry beneath the surface. Afterward, he insisted on visiting the wounded. No one corrected the driver when the route changed. The car slowed, turned, stopped, and there, only a few steps away, stood one of the boys who had already given up. He had wandered off, bought food, tried to calm his shaking hands. He did not expect a second chance. History parked itself in front of him. Two shots broke the air. One struck the woman, one struck the man. She spoke first, confused, reaching for him. He spoke next, trying to reassure her. Then they were silent. Blood darkened fabric. The car rolled away too late. In minutes, the future changed direction. The boy was seized, beaten, dragged through crowds that didn't yet understand what had happened. He would never see the empire fall. He would never see the war end. He would rot in a cell, coughing, wasting away, while the world burned outward from his moment. In the capital of the empire, grief quickly turned to rage. Officials did not ask whether war was wise. They asked how soon it could begin. The assassination became proof of everything they already feared. Their patience ended. Their restraint evaporated. They prepared an ultimatum. It was written to be impossible. Demands stacked on demands. Sovereignty erased in polite language. Compliance was expected. Rejection was desired. The small nation at the center of it all read the document in silence. Its leaders argued through the night. In the end, they accepted nearly everything. Nearly it wasn't enough. The declaration of war followed. And then the machine woke up. Mobilization orders were issued like reflexes. Trains hissed and screamed as they filled with men who believed they were defending their homeland. Mothers cried quietly. Fathers stood stiff and proud. Sons tried to look brave. Russia moved to protect its kin. Germany moved to protect its ally. France moved because Germany moved. Britain hesitated, then watched a neutral country get crushed under marching boots. That hesitation ended. Declarations stacked like falling dominoes. Borders meant nothing now. Timetables mattered more than reason. Once the trains rolled, stopping meant collapse. By August, Europe was at war. The early fighting moved fast, too fast. Plans drawn in peace failed in motion. Armies collided and wreaked havoc. Towns burned. Refugees flooded roads with carts and blankets and children who didn't understand why they were running. In the West, troops marched in bright uniforms that made them easy to spot. They believed courage could beat steel. Machine guns corrected that belief in minutes. In the East, battles stretched across vast spaces. Armies lost direction. Commands lagged. Defeats came suddenly and completely. By autumn, the movement slowed. Men dug. They dug because the ground was the only protection left. Trenches cut into fields and forests, twisting like scars. Barbed wire grew between them. Mud-filled boots, rain-soaked coats. Rats arrived. Lice followed. The war froze into place. Shells fell day and night. The sound never truly stopped. Sleep came in pieces. Food tasted like metal. Letters home became careful, stripped of truth. By winter, the front stretched from mountains to sea. Millions stood facing each other across broken land, waiting for orders that promised only more of the same. And then, briefly, something strange happened. On a cold December night, singing drifted across the trenches. Not orders, not warnings, songs. Men climbed out, cautiously, hands raised. They met between the lines. They shook hands, shared food, buried the dead. For a moment, they remembered they were human. The guns returned the next day. The war had begun with a mistake. It had settled into routine, and no one could yet see how long it would last, or how deeply it would carve itself into everything that came after. By the second year, the war had lost its illusions. What remained was endurance. The trenches did not move much anymore. They simply deepened. Men learned the shape of their section of earth, the way farmers once knew fields. Every corner had a smell. Every bend had a memory. Mud became permanent. Silence became suspicious. Above them, the world kept inventing new ways to kill. Poison gas drifted across no man's land like a living thing. It crept low, hugging the ground, slipping into lungs before anyone understood what it was. Eyes burned, throats closed. Men clawed at their faces, desperate for air. Masks arrived later, clumsy, uncomfortable, never fully trusted. Gas did not end the war. It only changed the way men feared the wind. Artillery ruled everything. Shells fell by the thousands. day after day, tearing the land apart inch by inch. Forests vanished, villages flattened, maps became useless, time blurred into noise. Commanders still believed in breakthroughs. They planned offensives that promised decision. Instead, they delivered slaughter measured in yards gained and names lost. One fortress city became a symbol of stubborn survival. For months, men were rotated in and out, fed into a grinding battle meant to bleed an enemy dry. Neither side truly advanced. Both sides bled anyway. The ground itself seemed to breathe smoke. To relieve pressure there, another massive attack was launched elsewhere. Whistles blew. Men climbed ladders. They walked forward into gunfire because they had been told the enemy was gone. They weren't. By the end of that summer, hundreds of thousands were dead or wounded. The front barely shifted. Commanders called it necessary. Soldiers called it hell. New machines appeared. Tanks rolled forward, slow and unreliable, but terrifying. They broke wire. They crushed obstacles. They hinted at a future where steel replaced flesh. Airplanes buzzed overhead, first as observers, then as fighters. The sky joined the battlefield. Under the sea, submarines hunted silently. Merchant ships vanished beneath waves. Cargo never arrived. Civilians far from the front began to feel hunger as sharply as soldiers felt cold. The war expanded outward. Empires dragged their colonies into it. Men from distant lands fought and died on soil they had never heard of before. They wore unfamiliar uniforms and learned unfamiliar words for fear. The war called itself European, but the world answered. In the east, the fighting moved differently. Armies clashed and withdrew over vast distances. Losses were staggering. Supplies were thin. Leadership faltered. One empire, already unstable, began to crack. Helm. Shortages sparked anger. Bread lines grew. Trust faded. Soldiers questioned orders. Workers questioned rulers. The strain became too much. Revolution whispered, then shouted. By 1917, the Eastern Empire collapsed inward. Its ruler abdicated quietly. Stunned by how quickly loyalty evaporated, a new government tried to continue the war. It failed. Another revolution followed. This one promised peace at any cost. That cost was territory. And withdrawal. The Eastern Front dissolved, freeing divisions to move west. For a moment, it seemed the balance might tip. Across the ocean, a distant power watched ships sink and messages intercepted. Neutrality eroded. Anger grew. Eventually, words were not enough. Fresh troops began to cross the sea. They arrived inexperienced but energetic. They brought numbers. They brought belief. They brought the sense that something new had entered the war. In the spring of 1918, a final gamble was made. A massive attack surged forward, fast and violent. For weeks, it worked. Lines broke. The ground was taken. The defenders staggered. But speed became weakness. Supplies lagged. Exhaustion spread. Momentum slowed. Then the counterblow came. This time, it was coordinated. Artillery, tanks, aircraft, infantry moving together. The pressure was relentless. Step by step, the attackers were pushed back. Morale cracked. Hunger followed them home. In cities far from the trenches, protests erupted. Sailors refused orders. Workers struck. The idea of victory felt hollow. One by one, leaders stepped aside. Crowns fell. Flags changed. The war had consumed too much to continue pretending. On a cold morning in November, representatives met in a quiet forest. Papers were signed. Orders sent. At a precise hour, the guns stopped. The silence was strange. Unsettling. Almost painful. Men waited, unsure if it was real. It was. The war was over. But the world it left behind was broken in ways no treaty could fully repair, and the hardest part was yet to come. When the guns fell silent, the world did not exhale. It hesitated. Soldiers climbed out of trenches slowly, as if noise might start again if they moved too fast. Some stared at the sky, others at the ground. Many simply sat, unsure what to do without orders telling them where to stand or when to run. 4 years of violence had rewired time itself. Peace felt unreal. Across Europe, bells rang and crowds gathered. Flags waved, people hugged, strangers, yet beneath the celebrations ran confusion. Victory did not feel clean. Defeat did not feel finished. Everyone had lost something, and no one knew how to ask for it back. The war had ended without a parade through an enemy capital. Instead, empires collapsed quietly, like buildings with rotten foundations. One emperor fled. Another abdicated. Thrones that had lasted centuries vanished in weeks. Black maps were redrawn by men who had not seen the villages they divided. In Paris, leaders gathered to decide the future. They arrived with different moods and very different memories of the war. Some came to punish, some to protect, some to dream. They spoke of peace, but their voices carried anger. The defeated were not invited to negotiate. They were summoned to accept. When the treaty was presented, it was long, detailed, and heavy with blame. One nation was told to accept responsibility for the entire catastrophe. Its army was cut down, its territory reduced, its economy bound to payments that would last generations. It signed anyway. The room was silent when the pens stopped moving. For those who believed the war had been a shared failure of pride and fear, the treaty felt wrong. For those who had watched their land burned and their people buried, it felt justified. Peace, like war, was uneven. Elsewhere, old empires shattered into new states overnight. Some celebrated independence. Others discovered they had traded one ruler for many problems. Borders sliced through communities. Minorities found themselves unwanted guests in freshly named countries. Promises of support had been made freely during the war. Afterward, they were remembered selectively. In the East, a new ideology took hold amid chaos. Civil war followed revolution. Hunger followed hope. A vast nation rebuilt itself around a different idea of power, one born from exhaustion and fury. Farther south, another fallen empire was carved apart by outsiders. Lines were drawn across deserts and mountains with little regard for the people who lived there. Mandates replaced monarchs. Resentment took root quietly, patiently. The economic cost of the war settled in slowly. Then all at once, inflation soared. Savings vanished. Jobs disappeared. Veterans returned home carrying injuries no one could see. Governments struggled to pay debts. Trust in institutions thinned. Some societies changed for the better. Women who had filled factories and offices while men fought demanded more than gratitude. In some places, they were heard. In others, they were told to step back. But the idea had already escaped. It would not return quietly. Art and literature darkened. Pain entered language. The old stories of glory sounded hollow. Poets wrote of mud and loss. Painters showed broken faces and twisted bodies. Memory refused to be gentle. A generation learned to live with ghosts. International cooperation was proposed as a cure. A League of Nations was formed, meant to prevent future wars. Through discussion instead of voice, it had hope. It had rules. It lacked power. Some of the strongest nations stood outside it, unwilling to be bound. Peace held, but it creaked. Underneath the calm, bitterness simmered. The defeated felt humiliated. The victorious felt unsatisfied. The new nations felt fragile. Everyone felt tired. The war had ended, but it had not taught restraint. It had taught efficiency. As the years passed, anger found new voices. Economic hardship sharpened political edges. Extremes sounded comforting to those who felt betrayed. More uniforms returned to the streets. Slogans replaced nuance. The world tried to move on, but it kept tripping over what it refused to face. World War I had promised to end wars forever. Instead, it rewrote the rules for how they would be fought, remembered, and justified. The peace, stitched together with hurried hands, held just long enough for the next storm to gather, and it was already forming on the horizon.